What is pedagogy? So pedagogy, this is the ultimate technical teaching term. It's the one that, at all costs you avoid using when you're writing for a general audience, when you're not writing for teachers, basically. So usually, I wouldn't bother with this, but maybe just a little bit of insight into this term, into what it means and why it matters, might help people to get a slightly better understanding of what actually goes on in our classrooms. And that's kind of the whole point of this. So, a definition of pedagogy. If you look it up online, what you're probably going to get is something along the lines of pedagogy is the method and practice of teaching, or the method practice, maybe sometimes talk about the theory of teaching, that kind of stuff, which really isn't very helpful for most people either. I think maybe a helpful way for non-teachers to think about pedagogy, it is the decisions that a teacher makes as part of their teaching process. It's down to the approaches that we take to tackling a particular issue, the types of questions that we use, or the style of questioning that we adopt, the kind of tasks that we deploy. Also, maybe even the kind of culture that different kinds of teachers develop in their classrooms. All of this comes down to choices that are made, decisions that are made, that come down to this thing about, the practice of teaching, about how we actually make teaching happen, or perhaps, I suppose more accurately, how we use teaching to make learning happen. Because it's maybe not as direct a relationship as people sometimes think it is. In terms of pedagogy, very broadly speaking, and apologies to the teachers who are going to complain to me about this, but very broadly speaking, there are two types. There's behaviourism, which is where we put the teacher at the centre. Think of that as what you might call traditional pedagogy. Teacher at the front, in the middle, they know things, they're teaching the kids. And then we have something that is sometimes called, again, I think unhelpfully, constructivism. That's maybe more about putting pupils at the centre, making it more about the process, the interaction. This is sometimes referred to as progressive pedagogy. And sometimes you'll see these things presented as being in pretty sort of direct conflict with each other. You either go traditional or you go progressive. You either stand and talk to the kids, or you engage in group discussions that let them discover things. It's not actually, as ever, that simple. It's also not limited just to those two areas. As I say, there's all sorts of aspects of pedagogy that you might want to look at as well. One other area that I think is worth mentioning is something that's sometimes referred to as liberationism. It's connected to a Brazilian educator called Paulo Freire, who wrote a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is very much worth reading. But in that kind of pedagogy, the focus is more on things like democracy and diversity, managing equity in the education system in order to overcome barriers that are preventing people from learning. It's quite a radically different perspective on education, but even then, it doesn't exist in some kind of silo. It's not completely disconnected from different kinds of pedagogy. It's part of the choices that teachers need to make. And realistically, as I said there, that sometimes these things are seen kind of in isolation or in conflict with each other. But the vast majority of teachers actually blend the different approaches depending on what they need and depending on what it is that they're trying to achieve. You do sometimes, if you go looking for them, you might find these kind of very heated debates, sometimes more so in England, it has to be said, than up here, but these really heated debates where chosen pedagogy is some kind of identity or something like that, but it completely misses the point. It really isn't a fair reflection of why pedagogy matters in schools. Because the thing is, I'm saying there are these different approaches and these different kind of ideas, and it all relates to different aspects of teaching, as I say, tasks or questioning or lots of different kinds of things. What that means is that different teachers are therefore going to favour different approaches. They're going to favour different combinations of approaches for different kinds of situations. They might vary them depending on the classes they're doing. They might vary them different ways within the classes that they've got. Now, some people see all that variation as a threat, particularly people on the outside of the classroom, people whose job is more, managing things. They see all that variation as a threat sometimes because, it's not coherent to them because they struggle to understand it. But it's not a threat. All that variation is actually an absolutely vital part of what teaching's all about, and it's a sign of how skilled educators are and need to be to do their job. You know, with so many issues, the debate around education becomes really, really simplistic, and we get sometimes very loud voices who think that, you know, in this case, for example, think ultimately that the education is, you know, teachers, like I used to be, teachers say stuff and then the pupils will know the stuff. And once they know the stuff, then job is done and you move on. But it doesn't work that way at all. If I'm sitting down trying to figure out how to say, I've got some new poem that I want to teach with a class, I need to make all kind of decisions around the kind of materials that I use, decisions on how I might engage the students. I might make different choices based on the different sort of required outcomes that we're looking at. You know, if I'm teaching a poem, say, to a class that's got a higher exam at the end of the year, the pedagogy I use will probably be different from the way I might teach it to like a first year class, who are engaging with it in a different kind of way. And so what this means is that actually the success of young people's learning, and that's what's supposed to be the priority here, but the success of young people's learning often really is going to come down to how successfully teachers are able to make these choices. It comes down to their ability to leverage their expertise. And the problem with expertise is it takes a long time. You know, to develop those kind of abilities, that's not something that just happens overnight. Teachers get better with time, and they get better pretty consistently over the first 2 decades of their career, because that kind of experience allows for the development of their pedagogical skills. But you need to nurture that stuff. You know, you can't just expect it to happen. It doesn't just happen by osmosis either. If you want the best education for your kids, then you need to think about the fact that teachers need access to continuing professional development that allows them to constantly enhance and develop their pedagogy, enhance and develop their teaching skills. Now, to do that, you need money and you need time. You need funding for courses and funding for access, but you also need, as I've mentioned quite a lot up to this stage, you need non-contact time for teachers to do the kind of assessment and reviewing and planning that's involved in making the right pedagogical choices for what you're trying to teach and the people that you're trying to teach. It's maybe the way to think about this is that, you know, if we want to make things better, it's not about trying to improve education so much as trying to improve teaching. But improving teaching is a question of improving pedagogy. And that's a question of whether or not we make sure that our teachers have the time and the resources and the trust to do that job properly.